All right, I think we'll get started. Welcome to those that are here as well as those that are on Zoom. This is our May 3rd, 2023 Planning Commission business session. And first of all, we also would like to recognize that we have Elena Daisley from our Youth City Council, and we're glad to have you here joining us. So welcome, and feel free to ask questions as we go along and contribute where you'd like. First of all, are there any ex parte communications that need to be disclosed by any of the commissioners before we get started? Seeing none, and I'm not seeing anything from Commissioner Chappell, so I'm assuming none from her as well. For this first stage, just for the public, this is a general public comments time. So this is an opportunity for individuals to make general public comments that do not relate to any of the projects scheduled for public hearing under the business items section of this agenda. So non-related items, and we will entertain any of those public comments. You will have 3 minutes, and is anyone here to make a general public comment this time? We've got one hand. Well, go ahead and come to the microphone. No, if it's related to the business item, then you'll get a moment. So great. B-23-001. A public hearing and possible recommendation on a subdivision exception at 3457 East Magic View Drive. The proposal seeks exceptions to the lot size and setback requirements for lots adjacent to private streets. And we will turn the time over to staff at this point for the presentation.
Thank you, commissioners. You just got this, but we're going to do it again. This is a request from Mike Spainhauer on behalf of the property owner, Kevin Langlois. I don't know if I said that right, but I tried. For a Title 14 exception, as it applies to a potential subdivision at 3457 East Magic View Drive. Here's a summary of the property. It's visible on this screen to the right here for those in attendance. It's 1.27 acres of property. It's one single family parcel right now. At the end of a private driveway named Magic View Drive, which is the same name as the public street to the south. They are requesting exceptions from 2 provisions in Title 14, both relating to lot standards on private streets, one being the front setback requirement on private streets, one being the minimum lot size required on private streets. Staff's recommendation is approval of this, and we will go through why that is. The current zoning is residential single family R18. That generally means in an R18 zone, you can only develop a single family residential use. And any lot you develop on, among other requirements, has to be at least 8,000 square feet. But 8,000, that's where the 8 comes from. That's the magic number there. The procedure that the application's been made under tonight comes out of Title 14. And that title regulates a lot of different things. It's called highways, sidewalks, and public places, but it's kind of this catch-all of development standards that apply to all sorts of development related requirements. But the exceptions provision states that in cases where unusual topographic, aesthetic, or other exceptional conditions or circumstances exist, variations or exceptions to the requirements of this chapter may be approved by the City Council after receiving recommendations from the city's Planning Commission and department, provided that the variation or exceptions are not detrimental to the public safety or welfare. So that's the parameter with which the Planning Commission is reviewing this tonight, needing to find that there are unusual circumstances that exist on this property and that approval of the exceptions are not detrimental to the public safety or welfare. The commission's role in this, again, is to review the request, take public comment, and then eventually, when you're ready, to forward a recommendation to the City Council. And the City Council is the final approval body. The provision that the exceptions come from, or the requested exceptions come from, is listed here. And it states that any building lot that is located outside a planned unit development, which this lot does, which fronts on a private roadway with at least 25 feet of paved surface, shall have a minimum lot area of 1/2 acre. The minimum distance from the center of such roadway to the front building line on such a lot shall be 50 feet. I will also note that approval of any exception does not entitle the subdivision, does not approve the subdivision of lots. That's a separate process that the applicant would still need to go through. That would include grading plans and slope analysis and sensitive land studies, and everything else that's always required for subdivisions would still be required. The exception does not get them around that, nor does it approve any building permits or structures to be built. That is required through the building permit process. The applicant's rationale for why they feel this request complies with the exceptions provision that I just read is that there are unusual topographic conditions that exist. There is a steep hillside encumbering much of the lot. Subdivision of lots will require renaming of the private roadway for addressing, which is actually better for public safety as opposed to detrimental to public safety. The shape and layout of the lot makes it difficult to comply with Title 14 standards, even though adequate acreage exists. And other homes in the area do not comply with the same provision that the applicant is asking an exception from. I'll go through a quick staff analysis of this as well, and then that will end in staff findings for our recommendation. The lot is irregularly shaped. It is at the end of a private driveway, but the private driveway does not continue. It just kind of ends at this property. The lot lines, it's not a conventional rectangular lot like you see in much of the city. It is an odd lot. It is not common. The entire area was constructed around 1975. It's remained largely unchanged. Little property adjustments here and there have occurred, but the area is largely as it was when it was originally developed. And all of this area, especially along the private driveways, what we would consider legal non-conforming. I haven't reviewed it in great detail, but it just appears that a development of this nature would not look the way it does if it were to be developed today. It would be subject to a lot of different requirements. There are 6 total lots that access that via that same private driveway. And they're all to the east of the subject property. The driveway itself shares the same name as the public street to the south. And if a lot is subdivided and added here, there is no new address that falls in numerical sequence in the way that the county and the city require addresses to be assigned. That could be provided to this lot using Magic View Drive, which would mean that the whole private driveway would need to be renamed essentially as its own private street, and the new address is assigned based on that, which again, per feedback from the emergency dispatch office, police and fire is actually much better for public safety than a private road that shares the same name as a lot or as a road that already exists. If granted, the exceptions would be utilized by the applicant to propose a 2-lot subdivision. They're proposing to develop 2 single-family homes on the property. There's an existing home. They are proposing to rebuild that home. And then they would also propose to subdivide off a single-family lot on the southeast corner of the property, where there's a kind of a square-shaped flat area today. The steep hillside portion of the property is to the north and the west. So the new lot is not on any portion of the lot that has substantial slope. And as I stated in the business meeting, even though there's a subdivision plan shown on the screen here, this has not been reviewed in any technical manner by the city, other than the general parameters of subdivision requirements, which is where we caught these Title 14 provisions. This is just a graphic that illustrates the addressing issue and the road naming situation that exists today. You can see that private driveway there is named Magic View Drive, but so is the public street to the south. And all the addresses are derived from that public street to the south. So you have properties, roughly 6, that have addresses of Magic View Drive that are not visible from the public street from Magic View Drive. And the private driveway is a little hard to find. There's just a little access road at the end of the cul-de-sac. So certainly renaming this and assigning addresses based off of a unique named private roadway does help for emergency access and navigability to those lots. Here's just a couple exhibits showing how the requested exceptions would apply. Given the odd arrangement of the lot today and kind of the unique proposal that they've submitted for how they would divide the lots, measuring front setback is a little tricky, particularly on the larger lot where the proposed structure on the left is located. That's where the existing home is today. So at staff's best interpretation of this is that the front of the lot would be the east side of that. With the proposed second lot there, that becomes kind of a double front yard there, where we would measure 25 feet from the north side of lot 2 and from the west side of lot 2. How to implement the 50-foot setback requirement from the middle of a private road is a little tricky in this circumstance, because the private road ends where this lot begins. So depending on where you measure, at some points the proposed home is less than 50 feet away. In some points it's not. It's difficult to interpret. So the exception requested does clean that up a bit. That being said, they are still proposing to fully comply with the 25-foot setback, which is the minimum required in an R18 development. Lot 2, which would be the new lot proposed in the southeast corner of the property, is requesting 2 exceptions. One is in lot size. As I read earlier, the minimum lot size for lots off of private streets is required to be half an acre, regardless of what the underlying zoning is. This one is proposing to be 8,000, just over 8,000 square feet, which does comply with R18 standards, just not with this private roadway requirement. And then when we look at the measurement of the front setback to the middle of the private street, that today is 39 feet. This 25-foot measurement, that property line is at the edge, the southern edge of the existing private driveway. The middle of that private driveway is where you see that 39-foot measurement. So the exception there would be a reduction from a 50-foot requirement down to 39 feet. And then when we look at this more practically, like we do on private or on public streets, that home still does have a 25-foot setback from the edge of the private roadway, which again is compliant with R18 standards. Based on this analysis, staff's findings here are that the subject property is located in a legal non-conforming subdivision. The development layout, the irregular shape of the property can be defined reasonably as an unusual topographic, aesthetic, or exceptional condition. Neither requested exception results in a violation of typical R18 development requirements for lot sizes, setbacks, other things like that. Any future subdivision, like I said, is still subject to full review and compliance with every other aspect of city code. The private driveway addressing will be improved by subdivision requiring new addresses and roadway name, and this does enhance public safety. And then other nearby homes also do not comply with especially the 50-foot roadway setback provision that the applicant is requesting an exception from. For those reasons, staff is recommending approval. I do have model motions here. I can put those up later if you're ready for them. I know the applicant is here tonight, and it looks like we have a number of residents interested in sharing comment, but do you have any questions for staff?
Just one question. The
Sure.
renaming of the road seems like it could be a separate issue that ought to be done anyway, independent of this discussion.
It's certainly recommended. The city doesn't have a mechanism to go in and impose that outside of new development happening where there is no number to provide. We have done this in other cases that, like I said, there are a few other areas of the city. There's one off Creek Road where in the past, the city has sent letters recommending, hey, for public safety and visibility, we recommend you change your addresses. Here's what we would recommend. Ultimately, it's on them to initiate that. But this we would have a little more authority to do that. Okay, thank you.
Okay, do we have a presentation coming from the applicant, or does the applicant have anything they would like to share?
Mike Spainhauer, architect for Kevin Langlois. Just probably needing to clarify a few things from the comments in the work meeting in there. This lot 2 there, the 25-foot setback, that's there only to say that we are 25 feet from the property line if that was a front yard property. So that's why there's the 2 dimensions there. The 39 feet is from the center of road. The 25 feet is to the current property line. Neighboring properties, there's also a question about if the neighbor's properties met the 50-foot setback or how far off they were. I know the first two properties to the east are right around 25 feet. As I studied this, it looked like that was a purposeful depiction of where those houses are to be. It was 25 feet from the edge of the paving, not the center line. From the edge of the paving was 25 feet. So not only do the neighboring properties not meet the 50-foot from center of road restriction, it also does not meet the acreage of half acre, because even though the land itself is a half acre, there's a code that says 30% of land that has 30% slope can only be counted in that acreage. So if you count only the 30% portion of the lot that's 30% sloped, they fall under the half acre requirement. So both exceptions are in line with the neighboring properties. Any questions?
Thank you. Hey, I think we're ready to hear from the residents and the community. So when you, we've not taken comment cards, have we?
I have not received any comment cards. If anyone filled out a comment card, they can provide those up here at the front or to staff right here. But I have not received any from
Okay.
anybody.
If you'd like to, just by a raise of hands, how many people are anticipating they'd like to share something on this item? A few, okay. We are anxious to hear from the public. So when you come to the microphone, if you can state your name and where you live, and then you'll get 3 minutes. And I may be a little tough on you because 3 minutes is 3 minutes, and we need to honor each other's time. So I will probably cut you off at 3. So please don't take that personally. And we're so glad to have you here. Public engagement is really important to us as a planning commission, to the city. So who wants to go first?
Chair, do you mind if I just check with our city recorder? Do you need them to fill out a comment card if they're giving their name and address into the mic? Okay, I can retroactively give them a comment card to fill out. Okay,
That
I'll
would be
stack.
great. Okay.
I should also note, sorry, we did receive a number of public comments prior to the meeting. Those have been distributed to the commission members. We received 2 more today after the deadline. They were both in support of the exception being granted. Those will be distributed to you after tonight's meeting.
Okay, great. Okay, please go ahead.
Sounds good.
There you go.
Hello. My name is Adam. I've been a neighbor of 3 years. I live directly downhill. So certainly some concerns later around building as far as, the Draper slides, and I apologize, I have a little cough due to seasonal allergies. But yeah, there are a couple things I wonder about. One that hasn't been mentioned. Why is this road still private? Why hasn't it become public? And would that solve a number of the problems? This was the original landholder for this entire area, who then parceled off a lot of the lots to everybody else. And it just seems like that should be cleaned up before any more development or changes happened. Secondly, as part of that development, a number of the houses that have been referenced nearby as reasons why setback exceptions could happen. I think a number of those houses were actually grandfathered in pre-incorporation. It's been interesting hearing stories about a number of other houses on this sensitive lands area who have kind of snuck their way into changes in the same way. And people have done it. And it's a beautiful area to live. And I totally support people trying to, continue to build and find ways to live there. But, I don't think that it can be ignored, the paths that people take towards expanding these plots. And if the example is being used are grandfathered in plots, then I don't think that those are good examples. Like this is now a private road. They live by certain exception laws, and those should be, maintained. So I think that's it. I submitted some online comments as well. Hopefully you got all those. Thank you for the time, and It's a beautiful piece of land. It really is. So hoping for the best for it.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kevin Langloy. I'm the homeowner at 3457 East Magic View Drive. I just wanted to come up and introduce myself and once again, thank you for the opportunity to review this and just a little background on me. I have owned the home since 2006. It's always been my dream to redevelop the home. The purpose of the second home is not for resale or anything of that nature. It's just for my family's use. I'm from Michigan originally, and I have a mother that's back there that's older, and I hope that, for her, she can spend more time out here, as well as my wife's parents and other family members and friends along the way. That the reason for that second lot is because it is a flat piece of buildable ground versus the steep graded slope, and I'm just hoping to be able to utilize the land that's there that to its highest and best use. So I appreciate your consideration. Thank you.
As a pilot, I wouldn't hold that against them.
Hello. I'm Norma Ruth Wynn Fox. And I just want to override a little bit about what that other fellow said. I was born in 1948 and was brought to that land as a brand new baby. So we didn't sneak in there. We owned the land post-depression. My father and his brothers and sisters pooled their money. So I just want, he can't say that everyone that's living on that lot or those lots were people who snuck in and took over. They were legitimately settling. We called it the ranch. And the Wynn family held it for years. So I just wanted to clear that up for my parents' sake. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments?
I'll just mention as comment cards are completed, for those who are speaking, feel free to just come and stick them right up here on the counter and we'll take care of them.
I'm Jack Forrester, and we've been a neighbor. We've been in the area for about 40 years, and been a neighbor of Kevin's. Our property borders his on two sides. So the new property that he's proposing, our backyard goes right to the side of it, and then it also goes right to the back. And I've got to know Kevin, and I'm convinced, I think you should approve it, that, anybody that's going to be improving that area, he's going to do a great job on. So I'm fully in support of it as being a neighbor. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Others, please.
Hi, everybody. My name's Aaron Christ-Johns. I'm also one of the adjacent landowners. My house is directly to the west of Jack's there, so my property is adjacent to Kevin's and backs up to his existing retaining wall. And I'm just up here just to echo support, as Jack had stated. The plans that Kevin's proposed, I think he's got quite a bit of support here in the crowd, but they are aesthetically pleasing, somewhat of a mountain modern design that would fit in well with the rest of the neighborhood. I don't believe even lot number 2 would stick out by any means. Overall, I think a lot of us view it as an improvement, not only for Kevin and his family, but for the neighborhood in general. Thanks.
Thank you. Glad to hear we have lots of adjacent neighbors. Anybody else? We have anyone online that that wants to speak to this?
There's one attendee, but I don't see a hand raised, so I think they're probably just listening in.
Okay, with that, I'm going to go ahead and close the public hearing for this item. And we'll begin the discussion with the Planning Commission. Who wants to get us started?
Mike, one question I had, and I'm sorry I didn't ask this in our work session, is and the architect reminded me that of this question of lot 1, what is buildable?
Well, the current ordinance says if any portion of a lot has a natural slope of 30% or greater, it's not buildable. That doesn't mean that's the only area that would be regulated. What we would require is they go do a slope stability analysis. They take sample, it's very technical. They take samples of the hillside and, you know, engineer it and propose mitigations, and you have to meet a lot of different technical standards. Sometimes that results in a recommendation that any structure have to be an additional setback off the top of any steep slope. So there are definitely areas of this property that are unbuildable. Certainly anything that's over 30%, but it could be even more than that. And the architect was correct. There is a provision related to residential density that says you can't just count 100% of very steep slopes towards the density to calculate, you know, subdivision or creation of lots. You can only use 1/3 of that area.
If there are additional public safety turnaround requirements that would push what would be considered the road even further into that lot number 2, what would be the result of this exception then?
Typically, those turnarounds, especially on private streets, they're not part of the private roadway. They're just easements on the property that are left unobstructed. Sometimes the fire department requires no parking, fire turnaround signs to be put up that have, you know, a hammerhead type turnaround or some sort of design where a fire truck can go in there and do a 2-point turn and get out of there. They typically also offer an alternative solution of fire sprinkling any new home there to eliminate the need for a fire turnaround. It's all regulated though by fire code, but the turnaround itself would not be impacted by the private roadway setback standards. We look at that differently.
Thank you. I have a couple questions, Mike. So I was reviewing Title 14. Just on the turnaround and other issue. Came across 1412-080 for cul-de-sac. And it had other language regarding turnarounds and configuration. One of the provisions in there talks about how the planning commission has to approve a turnaround and whatever else. I realize it's not platted now because nothing's been proposed or else, but if lot 1 comes with a building plan for a redevelopment, they're gonna have to propose something and then probably do something for a turnaround that would kick it back here.
I'm not familiar with the code you're referencing, but if any part of the remaining process requires planning commission approval, then it would have to come back. Yeah.
Okay. The other thing that immediately came to mind when I read the application, I read the public comments, et cetera, is it's always about the arbitrary increase standard. And in Cottonwood Heights's application of unusual topographic condition, when is in other jurisdictions they use sleds as a definitive demarcation of it's an unusual topographic condition. For other applications in which sleds has come up for a plat, has that been the trigger for the city from the staff approval? Or can you dig in or provide a little bit more clarification for
the rationale here? Yeah. We've only had a handful of these in the city's history, and they're all reviewed by their own merits, within their context, and they've been wildly different, all over the city. So I will just defer to this staff finding page as our rationale for why we feel, based on an analysis, our objective analysis of this, these are the bullet points, and there may be more detail in the staff report for why we think it's reasonable to conclude that there is an unusual condition that exists on this lot.
In staff's memory, has there been a denial for a planning application for any plat that had sensitive land overlay?
Well, that's for sensitive lands on its own. Typically the sensitive lands process will start, the review will go.
Right.
The city has occasionally and fairly regularly not accepted engineering reports that are submitted because they're deficient for sensitive land standards. When we're looking at exceptions, though, I don't think any have involved, sensitive lands being the only trigger for why a lot is unusual, because there are a lot of lots in the city that are in sensitive lands.
Sure.
To me, that alone would not satisfy the criteria. In this case, that's certainly part of it, in addition to all these other findings. But I would say the past exceptions have not been denied based on sensitive lands alone, but they haven't really been granted based on sensitive lands either. So I don't think I'm answering your question, but I don't think I understand your question.
Yeah, I mean, I was just exploring it a little bit. It was just something that kind of came to my mind in terms of this is literally one of my biggest pet peeves is when there's language in zoning ordinance that it's so open-ended and it's so subjective and it's never defined. And so it was just more a question of looking for guidance of historically, what has been the standard.
Sure.
Right or wrong, it becomes that legal precedence of what's arbitrary and capricious.
Yeah.
And I also, as part of this, I went back and looked at the R1A purpose and it sort of seems to meet the criteria. So I was just, it's always one of those things of like, depending on who you ask, anything's unusual.
Yeah, so I think setting aside sensitive lands, the previous exceptions, they've really been used for a lot of different cases, but like the city has been developed over decades under different provisions and rules and ordinances and jurisdictions. There are going to be cases that come up that are odd. They don't fit neatly into the current ordinance. So certainly that is one of the findings. I think on this property as well. What's unusual is the sensitive lands nature creates kind of an unusual condition where the largest portion of the lot is in the front corner of it, as opposed to the rear yard. So even if the applicant just wanted to build a shed or an accessory building and there's all this flat space and apparently used to be an airplane hangar there, you can't do that under today's ordinance. So again, that was another finding where we think this is a reasonable way to allow them to do something that, people in a typical R18 lot could do if they had the land for it.
One of the last things I kind of was mulling around was just based upon the other triggers that they're going to have to go through in terms of the full probably geotechnical survey. It's not inconceivable that they may not be able to redevelop the property. Is that?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that because I don't know. I don't have the data, but what I can assure is that I don't know if either of these proposed structures works where they are. I know that they have to comply with setbacks and slope stability requirements and things like that. I do see some conceptual encroachment into that steep slope area that concerns me from a sensitive lands code standpoint. But like I said in the work session, that comes next. This isn't approving these exact layouts and they do still have to clear those hurdles.
Yeah, I mean, that's because I don't have that exact overlay of like, and I'm just guessing that where the arc line is on the proposed structure where current setbacks, it looks different, not just a little bit.
Right.
But I mean, that's
I think on this
something that the city would look at in depth with
very carefully. Yes. Yeah.
And the other thing in R18, it had certain triggers based upon sleds for maximum height where it reduces the height to 30 feet versus 35. Does that come into play?
Yeah, so it says if you're in a hillside sensitive land zone, the maximum height of your structure is 30 feet as opposed to 35.
Okay.
So yeah, that feasibly would apply here as well.
But even if we approved it, we don't have to put it as a condition.
That's just code, so that would be required, yeah.
Thanks.
I'm sorry, ma'am. The public comments period is closed, so you'll need to
Oh, it's
return to your
closed, okay.
seat. So I apologize.
Well, that's all right. I just.
It's okay. I just need you to stop right there.
Oh,
So
boy. Okay.
thank you. I apologize. We go through this a lot and it's a difficult situation, but thank you. Okay, we'll continue deliberation.
Mike, I know I brought this up in the work session, but there's a lot of work that the applicant's putting into this to potentially not have something that's feasible based on the sensitive lands and the building envelope on lot 1 here. So I brought up the ADU opportunity here. Is there any variance just because this is on a private lane? The interpretation of the frontage here is a little interesting. Is there any opportunity for variance where that could be reinterpreted as a side yard to then turn this into an ADU in a way that would then allow for them to leave the remaining structure there, build ADU? And I don't want to reinvent anything here, but I just understand that sensitive lands is going to open up a whole other space for this. And I understand his intent is this being, staying with the land and separating that as two, the maintenance of that and, the fire turnaround, sharing that fire turnaround will create, if he decides to sell that off. So I just want to ask that question.
Sure. Yeah, good question. I have a couple points that you kind of triggered there. Regarding the variance, this actually started as a variance application. They requested a number of different variances. That goes through a whole different process through a hearing officer, has to meet very different kind of state mandated criteria. The initial staff review of that had some concerns with this application meeting a few of those criteria. Mainly because the Title 14 exceptions wouldn't be covered by the variance process. The variance is for zoning provisions that are in Title 19, a whole different chapter of the code. So you may be able to get a variance, but it still doesn't resolve the private street setback issue or the lot size off of private roadways because the variance chapter doesn't cover another title of the code. It doesn't cross that way.
Could you ask for an exception for frontage on a private lane?
Certainly you could. But what the applicant decided to do was to modify the variance application into this request for an exception instead, which they felt was a better way to achieve their needs on the property. Regarding reconstruction of the existing home, the full sensitive lands process will kick into effect if they do that. If they demolish the home and completely start over, they have to go through that whole process. There are steps, interim steps they could take. They could certainly do an extensive remodel of the existing home without relocating it or building a new structure, where if they're not expanding the footprint, they can do a lot of interior work, reside, paint, a lot of, use the shell of the home and really renovate it and maybe avoid a lot of that slope stability stuff because that structure is there already. Where they go rebuild and expand, that's where all this sensitive land stuff kicks in.
Is that structure going to be out of compliance if there's a new lot line, within probably 15 feet of that new lot number 2?
When new lots are created, we look at, hey, does this structure still meet setbacks? As shown here, it's showing 25 feet. I think the proposed structure is roughly in the same location, but they would have to subdivide this in a way that they still met that front setback requirement.
So can they leave that home there in lot number 1 if lot number 2 is then established and platted?
I think they can, but the applicant might be able to speak to that. And I don't know if they've done that analysis yet.
Just because if that now triggers, they now have to take down that house once that lot is new and, established. I'm just trying to think of a process standpoint here that it seems like if that is now within 10 feet of that lot line, which I was trying to do some measurements on Google Earth as we were here, but it seems like that would be out of compliance the second that lot is in place. And that's why I would propose for the applicant to look at potentially a variance process or an exception process to do an ADU in that space.
They did express interest in doing a detached structure there, and it's just so tricky, given the nature of the lot from a zoning standpoint. It seems feasible, it seems reasonable, and, you know, like it would make sense to put an accessory building there, but there's not a good zoning mechanism to do it. And like I said, the variance application they submitted still needed variances from this Title 14, except this Title 14 provision, which a variance cannot cover.
So
So you're making good points, but I think this is what they've identified as their, you know, best option to move forward with this. Now,
is that structure out of compliance once this is approved?
I think that's up for them to decide, but getting the exception will allow them to have confidence to move forward and keep doing that.
Perfect.
Other comments or questions from the commission? Commissioner Chapel, we haven't heard from you yet.
Yeah, I'm listening and I don't know that I have additional questions.
Okay. Let me ask a couple clarifying questions. Mike, did you have any contact with Unified Fire with this project at all?
We've had some development review committee meetings, some DRC meetings. They typically go over their standard requirements for turnarounds, for water pressure needed, you know, fire sprinkling requirements, just the standard stuff like that. Once we get an actual subdivision application, then they do their full review.
And then with this private road, you know, we were looking at that paved section and almost treating it as if it's a contiguous part. Even though that area that looks like a turnaround, that's on private property. So do they assume responsibility for the turnaround for the community simply because they are the last lot there? Or how does that fall?
Yeah, I think technically, you know, the private road itself falls on 6 or 7 different private properties. Those adjacent owners are responsible for that, making sure it's up to standard for emergency vehicles and things like that. Same would be the case with the turnaround. The property owner would be responsible for maintaining that and keeping it clear.
And do we know, I mean, with that's a pretty significant amount of history. I mean, I know at least the Perrys and the Ponds have been in that vicinity for 40 plus years. Is this when you mentioned, you know, problems with EMS getting in there and responding? Do we have any documented history of difficulty with them accessing it as it sits right now?
I don't know that there's been an issue, but certainly it's not an ideal situation to have duplicate roadways addressed where you don't have visibility. But I can't speak to whether there have been issues in the past. I think it's just something you hope there never are, and you hope it's always been great and smooth, but you can take steps to make it better.
Do we know where the nearest fire hydrant is?
Probably, I don't know off the top of my head though.
Okay.
Okay.
Up there? Here? Okay, apparently there, the very far eastern corner of this property. Yeah.
As we kind of talk and kind of see where we land on this, I might just point out to the public that, you know, we're a young city, you know, since 2005. And as was pointed out by staff, the jurisdictional decisions have been made and the history of this area have changed almost with every decade, and we try to do things better, but it does mean that we are all closer together and we try to do a little better with each time. And so a trigger often is that when somebody wants to do something and remodel, we hold them to a higher standard. And that's not just Cottonwood Heights, but just as we deliberate here, the intent is not to infringe on anybody's personal property rights at all. But at the end of the day, we understand things better now than we did 40, 50 years ago in terms of what's safe and what's ideal. And we're I think slowly coming together a little bit as a commission here. The other thoughts or feelings that you want to express just to your fellow commissioners before we get to a vote?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is that we're voting on the application before us. And that's always the problem with these situations is if this was my application, I might do it differently. If any of us would, if it was any of our applications, we'd probably have a difference of an opinion, but we have to vote and apply the law how that exists and with the application that's before us. Regardless of what happens in the future or whatever else. I mean, it's always, it's tough because I certainly see that there's some huge stumbling blocks to execute on both build outs of the property. But maybe that comes back to us, maybe it doesn't, but that's probably not before us today. It's just whether or not we give the exception and apply the standard of the unusual topographic and other standards. So I think that's probably where we have to land. Otherwise, the act arbitrary.
Other thoughts?
Yes, I agree with that. I think I think these discussions are worthwhile to consider all the variables that might come into play. But at the end of the discussion, we have a clearly defined question before us. And we don't want to get too far off into the weeds on some of these things, although I do think getting into the weeds is educational for all of us so that we can understand the process better. But I think it's been well presented and seems like a reasonable discussion that has occurred here. Thank you.
Any other thoughts before we come to a vote here? Okay, well, do we have a model motion? I'd entertain a motion if anyone feels so inclined.
I move to forward a recommendation of approval to the City Council for project SUB-23-001.
I second.
We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion on the motion? Are we ready for a vote? Okay, Commissioner Smith,
Yes.
Commissioner Shelton,
Yes.
Commissioner Steinman,
Yes.
Commissioner Anderson,
Yes.
Commissioner Ebler,
Aye.
Commissioner Chapel,
Yes.
and Commissioner Mills, yes. We will forward a motion of approval to the City Council for a final decision. Okay, any other additional discussion items? I don't know that we have any as a commission, any additional from the staff.
No, minutes weren't ready, so those will be next time.
Move to adjourn.
There you go.
Have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Oh, she's opposed.
I think that was an aye. And thank you, the members of the public. We really appreciate you being here and your level of engagement. It says a lot when neighbors come out and communicate. And I hope the sensitivity for the neighbor above and the neighbor below, that communication is good. Let's be, at the end of the day, be very good neighbors to one another. So well said, everyone, and good to be with all of you. And thanks again for your engagement.
For the commissioners, we've got our next meeting June 7th, I believe. I do anticipate that this meeting will actually be held on Zoom, most likely. So more information to follow, but a handful of us will be at a water use conference that week. So just as a heads up, it may be a Zoom meeting, but if you'll mark it on your calendars, June 7th is our next date.